As Madison stood frozen, tears streaming, Ronald looked her dead in the eyes and said, "You didn't just break my heart, you broke the version of me that trusted you without question." He turned, walked out the door without a backward glance, and sent the final email blast to her family, friends, and coworkers. Here's what she did. "I thought you should know." The silence in his apartment was finally peaceful. No more lies. No more waiting. Just truth and freedom. Thank you for watching, brothers. If you've ever felt that kind of betrayal, you're not alone. Drop a 1 in the comments if this hit you deep. Share your story below, someone out there needs to hear it. Subscribe for more raw, honest stories every week. And don't forget to share this video, someone's living through it right now. Sometimes revenge is just telling the truth, and walking away. The ring box in Ronald's jacket pocket felt heavier than it should have. He'd checked it at least 5 times already, still there, nestled in its velvet case, gleaming with a promise 3 years in the making. He paced the hardwood floor of his Denver apartment, glancing at the clock, then at the bouquet of white roses he'd carefully arranged. The reservation at Bellagio's was locked in, window seat, skyline view, a bottle of her favorite red already chilling. Everything had to be perfect. Tonight, he was going to ask Madison, the woman he thought he'd grow old with, to marry him. He'd played the moment out in his head 1,000 times, her surprised face, the tears, the laughter, the kiss. After 3 years of late-night takeout, weekend hikes, and quiet mornings with her curled up next to him, he was ready. This wasn't a risk. It was the most certain thing he'd ever known, or so he thought. That's when he noticed it, Madison's phone, sitting on the kitchen counter next to her half-finished coffee. She never forgot her phone. That thing was practically surgically attached to her hand. Ronald raised an eyebrow, mildly amused at first. Maybe she was in a rush this morning. Maybe it slipped her mind. But then it buzzed. Once. Then again. And again. Same number. Unsaved. 5 calls in 10 minutes. His stomach tightened. He stared at the screen, chewing the inside of his cheek. Was it work? An emergency? Her mom? She told him she was slammed at the office today, back-to-back meetings, probably wouldn't be home till 7. Still, something felt off. The buzzing continued. His fingers hovered over the phone. A voice in the back of his head told him to leave it alone. Another one, stronger, told him to answer it. He took a breath, and picked up. "Hey babe," a man's voice said, casual and confident, like they'd done this routine 100 times. "I've been trying to reach you." "Same room tonight?" "Can't wait to see you." Ronald didn't say a word. Couldn't. His mind blanked as the blood drained from his face. The voice on the other end paused. "Hello? Madison? You there?" He ended the call. Silence. Ronald stared down at the phone, hand trembling. He felt like someone had reached into his chest and twisted. His vision blurred for a second, like the room tilted under his feet. What the hell had he just heard? His thoughts came in flashes. Was it a prank? A client? Some sick misunderstanding? But that voice, it wasn't mistaken. It was intimate. Familiar. That wasn't how you talked to someone from work. That was how you talked to someone you were sleeping with. The phone buzzed again. Same number. Ronald stared at it, heart pounding. Everything, his proposal, his future, his certainty, cracked wide open. And he hadn't even opened her messages yet. He first met Madison in the most unremarkable way, waiting in line at a coffee shop near his office in downtown Denver. It was raining that morning, the kind of soft drizzle that soaks your sleeves before you even notice. Ronald, running late, had one AirPod in his mind on a conference call he wasn't ready for when he accidentally bumped into her, nearly sending her latte flying. He apologized instantly, flustered and red-faced, expecting her to be annoyed. But instead, she smiled. Not just politely, genuinely. There was a warmth to her that disarmed him immediately. Guess I needed a new drink anyway, she'd joked, brushing off her damp coat. He offered to buy her another, and to his surprise, she said yes. What was supposed to be a 30-second apology turned into a 10-minute conversation by the pickup counter. Madison was sharp, witty, and beautiful in a way that didn't seem to demand attention, but got it anyway. Ronald, who had always felt more comfortable behind code than conversations, felt a shift that day. She saw him. Not just the surface-level pleasantries, but something deeper. Vulnerable, maybe even a little lost, but real. They exchanged numbers before parting ways, and for the rest of that week, every time his phone buzzed, he hoped it was her. Their first real date was a low-key dinner at a tucked-away bistro that Madison picked. She showed up in a denim jacket, no makeup, and a crooked grin that told him she wasn't trying to impress, she was just being herself. Ronald had never dated someone so present. When she asked questions, she actually listened. When she laughed, it wasn't polite or restrained, it was full, from the chest. Over the following months, their lives slowly began to blend. She'd spend weekends at his apartment, curled up with him on the couch watching true crime documentaries or teasing him over his inability to fold a fitted sheet. He got used to her morning routines, the way she sang off-key while brushing her teeth, how she always put her socks in the freezer during summer because cold toes made her feel more awake. Sundays became their ritual, brunch at a little cafe near Cheeseman Park, long walks, then grocery shopping where they'd argue playfully over almond milk brands. They talked about the future, not in vague, dreamy terms, but with intent. Marriage. A dog. Maybe a little house outside the city. Madison talked about how she wanted to build a marketing firm from the ground up one day. Ronald, usually reserved about emotions, started opening up in ways he hadn't with anyone else. He'd tell her about his childhood, his fears, the parts of himself he rarely shared. It wasn't fireworks every day, it was better. It was peace. And in that peace, Ronald had let himself believe, wholeheartedly, that he'd finally found his person. But even the calmest waters can hide deep undercurrents, and looking back, Ronald could see the ripples had started months ago. It began subtly, little shifts in routine that he brushed off as stress or workload. Madison started working late on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always tied to some big client campaign with tight deadlines. She'd come home later than usual, sometimes well past 10, claiming the team stayed late to revise presentations or run mock pitches. At first, Ronald didn't question it. Madison had always been ambitious, and her dedication to her job was something he admired. But the rhythm began to change in ways that didn't make sense. Her clothes would occasionally smell faintly of hotel soap or unfamiliar cologne. Once, she came home with a wine stain on her blouse, laughing it off as an accidental spill from a work dinner. Another time, her blouse was unbuttoned one too many notches when she walked in the door. Then there was her phone, once left carelessly around the apartment, now it never left her side. She took it into the bathroom, kept it under her pillow while sleeping, and always swiped notifications away before he could glance at the screen. She changed her lock code without telling him, claiming it was for work security. At first, Ronald noticed but said nothing. He chalked it up to a privacy thing, maybe a boundary she wanted to reinforce. But that didn't explain the way she'd tilt her screen away or how her expression would shift subtly when a message came in. It didn't explain why she started replying to texts in the middle of the night, whispering that it was a client in a different time zone while her fingers danced quickly across the screen. There were nights he woke up and found her not beside him, but sitting in the kitchen, phone in hand, bathed in the glow of the refrigerator light, typing fast with a look on her face he hadn't seen before, something between anticipation and guilt. He asked once, gently, if everything was okay. She smiled, told him she was just wrapped up in this exhausting campaign and kissed his forehead. "Just trust me," she'd said. And he did. He wanted to. Still, a part of him, it started quietly, kept tapping at the edge of his thoughts. A gut feeling, a heaviness he couldn't name. But every time he began to question her behavior, he shut himself down. He reminded himself that relationships were built on trust, and that maybe he was just being paranoid. He wasn't the jealous type. He wasn't insecure. He'd convince himself he was overthinking, that he was the problem. He didn't want to become the kind of man who checked phones or tracked locations. So he buried the feeling and called it loyalty. He made her favorite pasta on the night she came home late. Bought her flowers just because. And every time doubt whispered in his ear, he forced himself to listen to love instead. What he didn't realize was that love wasn't supposed to sound like silence. Everything shifted the moment the screen lit up again. The same unknown number flashed across Madison's phone for the 5th time in 10 minutes. Ronald stood frozen in the kitchen, phone buzzing in his hand, his heart pounding with a dread he could no longer ignore. He told himself he was just checking to make sure she was okay. That if something were wrong, he needed to know. But deep down, he knew this was more than concern. His thumb hesitated for a second, then swiped up. No passcode. She'd always said she didn't need one, that there was nothing to hide. That phrase would echo in his ears for weeks to come. The message thread with the unknown number was the first thing he opened, and what he saw knocked the breath out of his lungs. The conversation went back months, bold, unfiltered, and devastating. There were photos. Not just selfies or flirty snapshots, but explicit, intimate images of Madison in hotel rooms, lingerie he'd never seen, and poses he never imagined she'd share with someone else. There were hotel names, room numbers, references to wine, playlists, inside jokes. Hyatt, 7:15. I want you again tonight. His hands shook as he scrolled. Every message was another punch to the chest, another confirmation that the life he'd been living, the love he believed was real, had been happening in parallel with something else entirely. Worse still were the texts that followed, laughing at him, mocking him with emojis and smug remarks. He still doesn't have a clue, one message read. Too busy playing video games while I'm getting wrecked. Ronald wasn't even a big gamer. Just a few hours on the weekends with Curtis, his best friend. But to see himself reduced to a caricature, some boring, oblivious loser in a side conversation between his girlfriend and her lover, was more humiliating than anything he could have imagined. And then came the line that made his stomach turn. A text from Madison, dated just a few weeks earlier, read, "I'm going to break up with him after the holidays. I don't want to ruin his Christmas." That was the moment Ronald almost dropped the phone. His entire body went cold. His legs gave out slightly, and he stumbled onto the couch, hand over his mouth, staring at the screen like it had slapped him. She wasn't staying because she loved him. She was staying for the optics. For the timeline. To make it easier on herself. That's when it all crystallized, every late night, every deflection, every fake smile. She wasn't planning a future with him. She was counting down the days until she could leave without looking like the bad guy. That's when the pain in Ronald's chest shifted. It wasn't heartbreak anymore. It was something darker, colder, sharper. Something close to fury. He didn't even remember walking to the liquor cabinet. One second he was staring at her phone like it might bite him, and the next, his hands were wrapping around the neck of a half-empty bottle of bourbon they'd bought on a weekend trip to Aspen last winter, one of those spontaneous getaways where she'd worn his hoodie and curled up next to him in front of a fireplace, saying she felt safest with him. The memory made his stomach clench. He poured 2 fingers into a glass but didn't wait, just drank straight from the bottle instead. The burn barely registered. His hands were trembling so badly he had to set it down before he dropped it. The apartment was too quiet. The silence screamed. Outside, Denver's skyline blinked softly through the windows, but it felt like a different city now, like someone had pulled the floor out from under everything familiar. Ronald slumped onto the floor against the kitchen island, the cold tile against his back barely grounding him. His body felt foreign, like his skin no longer fit right. This was the kind of pain that didn't shout, it hollowed you out slowly. He looked down at the engagement ring box, still closed on the counter, and the sight of it almost made him laugh. Not out of humor, but disbelief. That thing had been a symbol of hope 12 hours ago. Now it looked like a joke he didn't get. For the first time in years, he cried. Not loud, not theatrical. Just silent tears that rolled down his face while his shoulders stayed still. He didn't wipe them. What was the point? Every blink brought another memory rushing in, each one now poisoned. He remembered their first real vacation together, the way Madison had fallen asleep on his shoulder during a red-eye flight, mumbling something about how she couldn't wait to see Rome with him. He remembered the night they built a bookshelf together, and she laughed so hard when he hammered a nail in sideways that she nearly dropped her wine. He remembered how she used to kiss the back of his neck when he cooked, humming along to his old jazz playlists. It all came back, but now every image came with a crack in it, like watching a home movie where the sound has been replaced by static. Ronald had spent years building this version of love with her. He had believed in it, protected it, sacrificed for it. And now he was left holding the shattered pieces while she was off, probably laughing in a hotel bed with someone else, texting that she didn't want to ruin his Christmas. The thought made something inside him harden. Love didn't live here anymore, not in the way he'd known it. There was grief, sure. But beneath it now, there was something colder starting to take shape. Something with a purpose. Because once the crying stopped, all that remained was a single, clear thought: she wasn't going to get away with this. Somewhere between his third drink and the first signs of daylight peeking through the blinds, Ronald picked up his phone and typed out a message with fingers that still shook. He didn't second-guess it, didn't draft or redraft. Just 4 words: we need to talk. He sent it to Olivia, Madison's best friend since college, the one who'd helped him choose the engagement ring 2 weeks ago, the one who had smiled as they secretly coordinated a proposal outfit and venue for Madison. She replied within seconds, "Is everything okay?" He didn't answer that. How could he? There was no emoji or sentence that could summarize the grenade that had just gone off in his chest. Instead, he fired back a time and place. 8:30, Wilder's Coffee. Don't be late. He didn't sleep. Didn't need to. The whiskey, adrenaline, and heartbreak were enough to keep him wired. By the time he walked into the cafe the next morning, dressed in yesterday's wrinkled clothes and carrying a storm behind his eyes, he didn't feel like the man he had been just 24 hours earlier. The bell above the cafe door jingled as Olivia entered, her expression changing the second she spotted him in the far corner. She looked nervous, like someone who already knew the truth but had hoped to outrun it. Ronald didn't stand to greet her. He just stared. Olivia approached slowly, her usual bounce missing, and slid into the seat across from him. She looked him over, her brows furrowed. "Jesus, Ron, you look like you haven't slept." He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping through the gallery until the screen glowed with damning screenshots, the messages, the photos, the dates. He turned it toward her. She glanced down, and her face crumpled instantly. "Oh my God," she whispered. She didn't even try to fake confusion. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes went glassy. Ronald leaned back, arms crossed. "So," he said, voice flat, "how long have you known?" Olivia covered her mouth, tears welling. Ron, I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this. I found out a month ago." She swore it was just a fling. That she was ending it. "I told her she needed to come clean." Ronald narrowed his eyes. "But instead, you helped me plan a proposal." While she was sneaking off to hotel rooms. Olivia wiped at her cheek, ashamed. "I thought, if you proposed, she'd snap out of it. Remember what she had. I thought it would scare her straight. I thought she'd choose you." Ronald stared at her for a long moment, trying to process just how many people had been complicit in protecting Madison's lies. "You used me," he said quietly. "You let me walk into a proposal thinking it would save something that had already died." Olivia shook her head, voice cracking. "No, I didn't use you, I was desperate, Ron. She's been my best friend for 10 years. But I couldn't make sense of what she was doing. I begged her to end it. She promised she would after the holidays." Ronald scoffed. "Yeah. Because God forbid we ruin Christmas. He looked away, jaw clenched, then back at her. Do you even realize what you helped me do? That ring cost 3 months of my life. You helped me hand it to someone who was laughing about me in bed with another man. Olivia flinched, visibly wounded. I'm sorry, she whispered. I should have told you the second I found out. But I really thought she would do the right thing before it got worse. Ronald leaned in slightly, his voice lower, colder. Well, she didn't. And now? I'm going to make sure everyone she fooled sees exactly who she really is. Olivia looked up, eyes wide. What are you going to do? Ronald stood, tossing his empty coffee cup into the trash. I'm going to send a truth bomb. And you can either stay out of the way, or help me detonate it. The moment Ronald walked out of the coffee shop, the plan started forming, fast, sharp, and cold. The emotions were still there, rage, betrayal, heartbreak, but they were locked behind a wall now, channeled into something more precise. He went home, sat at his desk, and opened up every message thread, every photo, every file on Madison's phone he could find. He didn't skim. He studied. Each message was evidence. Each emoji, each hotel confirmation, each smug line about how clueless he was, he cataloged them all. He screenshotted entire conversations, organized them into folders, timestamped everything. He cross-referenced the dates with her calendar excuses and GPS data from shared photos on her social media. She hadn't even turned off location tagging. That's how little she thought he'd ever check. He backed everything up, twice. One copy on a hard drive, another on the cloud under an encrypted name. He even sent a copy to Curtis with no explanation, just in case something went sideways. Ronald wasn't impulsive by nature, but this wasn't impulsive. It was surgical. By Saturday morning, he was done being the victim. Madison always went to a 10 a.m. yoga class near Wash Park, the same one she bragged about being her sanctuary. Ronald used that hour to move out. Curtis pulled up in his truck at 9:45 sharp, and by 10 o'clock, they were grabbing duffel bags and boxes with quiet urgency. Ronald didn't take everything, just what was his. Clothes. Laptop. Books. His desk chair. He left the expensive kitchenware, the art prints, the wine fridge she insisted they buy last Christmas. But he paused when he saw the framed picture of the two of them in veil, smiling, arms wrapped tight, before everything started to unravel. He stared at it for a long second, then turned it face down. He left the apartment key on the counter next to a small velvet box, the engagement ring. Still unopened. Still perfectly centered in its packaging, like it had been waiting for a moment that never came. Ronald didn't need to leave a note. She'd know. The emptiness would say enough. As they loaded the final box into Curtis's truck, Ronald glanced around the living room one last time. The same room where he once imagined raising kids. Hosting family dinners. Laughing over wine and Netflix. Now it just felt like a crime scene. He closed the door behind him without looking back. Back at Curtis's place, he showered, changed into fresh clothes, and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop. It was time. He opened a blank email, typed out each recipient manually: Madison's parents, her younger sister, her close friends, her boss, and a few coworkers he remembered from parties and work events. He didn't use emojis. He didn't swear. Just facts. Calm, measured, irrefutable truth. He included context, screenshots, and select images, not enough to be indecent, but enough to make the reality impossible to deny. He ended it with one line: "You deserve to know who you've really been dealing with." Then he attached the evidence folder, took a deep breath, and hovered over the send button. His finger didn't shake. Not anymore. He clicked. The progress bar blinked. Done. That was it. The truth was out. Ronald closed his laptop, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in days, he felt clear. Not happy. Not even angry. Just clear. Madison had broken his heart. But now, she'd faced the cost of everything she'd hidden. And Ronald? He was done waiting around for closure. He just delivered it, straight to everyone's inbox. The apartment was already dark by the time Madison walked through the door, still in her yoga pants and oversized hoodie, carrying a smoothie in one hand and her phone in the other. She called out, cheerful and breathless, like nothing had changed. "Ron? I picked up your favorite, strawberry banana, no kale this time." But her voice faltered halfway through as she stepped into the living room. Her smile disappeared the second her eyes scanned the space. The bookshelf was half empty. The console table was missing his keys, his charger, his watch. The gaming chair was gone. So was his desk. She moved farther in, heartbeat picking up, glancing toward the hallway where the closet door stood wide open, revealing a noticeable absence of his coats and shoes. She didn't say anything at first, just slowly turned in a circle, taking it in. Then she spotted it on the counter. His apartment key. And next to it, the ring box. She reached for it with trembling fingers, opening the lid as if touching it could somehow reverse whatever she was feeling. When she saw the diamond, the ring she had dreamed about for months, her face cracked. "No," she whispered, breath-catching. "No, no, no." That's when the front door opened. Madison spun around as Ronald stepped back into the apartment, calm, collected, the same man she had once believed would never raise his voice. He didn't greet her. Didn't ask questions. He just walked past her, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen. Then he held it up as the sound of a recorded voicemail played through the speakers. "Can't wait to see you tonight, same room, same wine. You bring that little black dress again?" The voice was unmistakably male. Confident. Intimate. Ronald watched Madison's face drain of color. She froze, lips parted, smoothie forgotten in her hand. The recording ended. The silence between them was deafening. He lowered the phone slowly. Her throat worked to form words, but nothing came out at first. Then finally, "Ronald. I can explain." Her voice was thin, barely holding. He raised an eyebrow, his voice calm in a way that made it all the more brutal. "Explain what?" "That while I was planning to give you a life, you were giving someone else your nights." Her eyes welled up. "It wasn't serious, it didn't mean anything. I was confused. I didn't know how to." He cut her off. "You knew exactly how to lie. You were just hoping I'd never find out." She tried to reach for him, but he stepped back. "Don't." His tone was steel now. "Don't touch me. Don't lie to me. Not anymore." Madison's composure unraveled like paper in water. "I made a mistake. A huge one. But we can fix this. Please, just let me explain everything." He looked at her like she was a stranger, and in that moment, she truly was. Without a word, he walked to the counter, picked up the small velvet ring box, and held it between them. "You didn't get this," he said, his voice sharp but steady, "because of Derek." Her eyes widened. She wasn't expecting that name. How do you, I know everything," he interrupted. "Every message. Every hotel. Every picture. Every joke at my expense. I know about your plans to leave me after Christmas. I know about the wine stains and the perfume and the passwords and the silence." She reached for the box, as if claiming it could somehow undo the truth. Ronald pulled it away. "No. You don't get this. Not now. Not ever." Her tears finally spilled over. "Please, Ronald. I was going to say yes. I got scared." He shook his head, no pity in his eyes. "You didn't get scared. You got greedy. You had a safety net, and a thrill on the side. You wanted both." She dropped her gaze, shoulders shaking. But Ronald didn't flinch. "You say you were going to say yes. But you already said no every time you met him behind my back. You just didn't have the courage to say it to my face. He set the ring box down gently, turned his back to her, and walked toward the door. "I left the truth in your inbox. And everyone else's. I suggest you start reading." The storm didn't take long to hit. By Monday morning, the email had done exactly what Ronald intended. It went viral in all the places Madison never thought it would. Screenshots started circulating through her workplace within hours. Whispers turned into stares, and stares became conversations held just out of earshot. But the most devastating blow didn't come from her boss. It came from someone she probably never expected to hear from, Derek's fiancée. Turns out, the senior marketing director from Seattle, the one Madison had been sneaking off to meet at hotel bars and networking conferences, was very much engaged to a woman who had absolutely no idea what had been happening behind her back. Until now. She received the evidence. All of it. The texts, the photos, the receipts. Ronald didn't send it to her directly, but someone on the company thread clearly had. Her reaction wasn't quiet. She forwarded the entire folder to Derek's company email chain and to every major executive in their firm. Within a day, the private affair had turned into a public implosion. The professional fallout was swift and vicious. Derek was called into a closed-door meeting that same afternoon. According to Curtis, who had a friend in the HR department, he didn't walk out with his job. Madison, meanwhile, was summoned by her division lead. She tried to deny everything at first, or so the rumors said. Tried to spin it as a personal attack, an invasion of privacy. But the proof was overwhelming, and the emails from Derek's fiancée, angry, detailed, and impossible to ignore, left little room for interpretation. Madison's role was labeled as ethically compromised, and her continued employment was no longer tenable given the breach of conduct and reputational risk. Translation: she was done. The job she'd fought so hard for, sacrificed weekends and sanity for, gone in 2 meetings and a hallway of judgmental glances. Worse still, Derek didn't go down alone. He threw her under the bus. Claimed she pursued him. Said he'd been manipulated. Painted himself as a victim of her seduction. She had bet on him choosing her. Instead, he chose survival. But the collapse wasn't limited to her professional life. Personal connections began unraveling with just as much speed. Her parents, both of whom Ronald had CC'd on the email, responded within hours, not to him, but to Madison. According to Olivia, who was still feeding Ronald the occasional update, their reaction wasn't what Madison expected. Her mother called her behavior unforgivable. Her father told her he was deeply disappointed and didn't want her coming to Christmas unless she got her life together. Her younger sister, once her biggest fan, posted a cryptic Instagram story the next day about snakes hiding in plain sight, which friends immediately interpreted as a shot at Madison. As for her closest friends, a few responded to the email, most didn't. Some blocked her. Others ghosted her entirely. It turned out, not many people wanted to defend a woman who'd been sleeping with a married executive and humiliating the man she claimed to love. The social currency she'd built so carefully over years, likability, charm, reputation, was now worth nothing. That night, Ronald sat on the couch in Curtis's spare room, the lights low, scrolling aimlessly through his phone when Olivia's name popped up. It was a simple message. "She's broken. You ended her." He stared at the words for a long time, unsure how to feel. There was no joy in it. No satisfaction. Just a heavy silence. He typed back, "No. She ended herself. I just gave the truth a voice." Then he locked his phone, leaned back, and exhaled. Madison wasn't the only one who lost something, but unlike her, Ronald still had something left, clarity. And he intended to use it. Just as the dust was beginning to settle, and Ronald thought he'd finally reached the edge of the nightmare, the phone rang. It was Curtis. His voice on the other end didn't sound like someone checking in, it sounded like someone holding something too heavy to carry alone. "Dude," he started, then hesitated. "You're gonna want to sit down for this." Ronald was already seated, but the warning alone made his stomach tighten. "What is it?" he asked, not sure he wanted the answer. There was a long pause before Curtis said it. She wasn't just cheating with Derek. Ronald blinked. What do you mean? Curtis exhaled hard. I was at the Golden Tap last night, grabbing a drink with Travis, you remember, that guy who used to hang with Madison's college crew? Anyway, he was drunk and rambling, and he told me Madison had been hooking up with her ex. 4 months. Said they met up on girls' nights while you thought she was out for drinks and gossip. Ronald didn't speak. He couldn't. Curtis continued, his voice lower now. This guy she used to date, Eli. The photographer. Travis said Madison was seeing him again. Supposedly it was just casual, but, come on, man. Casual doesn't matter. Not when you're in a relationship. Ronald's mind was spinning. Eli. The name barely registered at first, then clicked into place. She had mentioned him before, once, maybe twice, always in passing. An old chapter, she called it. Ronald hadn't thought much of it. Why would he? He trusted her. And now that trust felt like a joke everyone else had been in on but him. You okay? Curtis asked, when the silence dragged. Yeah, Ronald finally replied, though it didn't sound convincing. Yeah, I need to go. He hung up before Curtis could say anything else. He sat in that silence, staring at nothing, his hands clasped in front of his mouth like he was holding in something that wanted to explode. The thing about betrayal is, once it starts unraveling, it doesn't stop. It pulls every memory down with it. Ronald sat there, eyes glazed over, feeling the weight of a new truth settle onto his shoulders. Derek wasn't the whole betrayal. He wasn't even half of it. There were layers to this he hadn't uncovered yet, and he began to wonder how many more were still hiding in the shadows. A 6-month affair was one kind of pain. But realizing you were just one of multiple options? That was something else entirely. He replayed every moment Madison had gone out with friends, every late-night vent session with Olivia, every casual I'll be home late, don't wait up. And now he saw it differently. She hadn't just betrayed him with one man. She had rewritten their relationship around her convenience. He wasn't even plan B. He was the placeholder, the safe guy, the steady one, the fallback while she chased chaos. That realization shattered something deeper than anger. He felt it in his chest, like a dull blade pressing down, slow and cruel. The tears came again, not like before, these weren't grief-stricken sobs. They were quiet, resigned, the kind you feel in your bones when the truth settles and there's nowhere left to hide from it. I wasn't even plan B, he whispered to himself, voice cracking. I was just the guy she came home to after it all. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands, breathing hard, trying to keep from falling apart again. Not out of weakness, but because he'd already broken once, and didn't know if he could survive doing it twice. The cruelest part wasn't the cheating. It wasn't even the lies. It was the ease with which she did it. The way she kissed him goodnight while someone else's fingerprints were still on her skin. The way she told him she loved him, while texting someone else that she couldn't wait to be free of him. And now this, another man. Another betrayal. Another scar. Ronald didn't know what kind of man he'd be after all this. But one thing was clear, whoever he was before, that version of him was gone. Forever. The moment his lease in Denver officially ended, Ronald packed up what was left of his things and drove south. He didn't announce it, didn't post about it, didn't leave a forwarding address. Just him, his car, and the silence of the open road stretching toward Austin. The city had always been in the back of his mind, a place with sun, space, and no memories attached. A clean slate. The drive was long and quiet, save for a playlist Curtis had made titled Fresh Starts and Middle Fingers. Ronald didn't laugh when he first saw it, but somewhere around Amarillo, one of the songs made him crack a grin. It wasn't much, but it was something. When he arrived in Austin, he moved into a modest studio above a plant shop on the east side. It smelled faintly of eucalyptus and old wood, and that felt right. The landlord was quiet, the neighbors kept to themselves, and the lease was short-term, just how he wanted it. He deleted old contacts, blocked numbers he should have blocked months ago, and set up a new phone with a new plan. Madison would never find him here, and if she did, she wouldn't recognize him anymore. The first few weeks in Austin were nothing like his life in Denver. No routines. No shared calendar. No emotional tightrope he had to walk to keep someone else happy. Just space. Mornings started slow. He'd wake up early, not because of stress, but because the light through his window made it impossible to sleep past 7. He joined a nearby gym, not to sculpt revenge muscles like some post-breakup movie cliché, but to work the weight out of his chest. Every rep was a silent scream. Every drop of sweat a word he never got to say. He took a job at a local software startup, a pay cut from what he'd been making before, but the team was small, the vibe was relaxed, and no one knew anything about his past. No awkward glances. No questions. Just a clean keyboard and a quiet corner of the office. He also started therapy, twice a week at first. It wasn't easy. There were sessions where he just sat in silence for 20 minutes before saying a word. But eventually, the words came. And when they did, so did the clarity. He learned how to unpack things without shaming himself. How to sit in the pain without letting it define him. There were still bad nights, nights when he'd lie awake wondering how many lies had slipped past him, how much of his life had been fiction. But then morning would come, and the light would pour in again. And each day, the sting dulled just a little more. He wasn't healed. But for the first time in months, he wasn't bleeding either. And in that quiet, he began to realize something important: surviving was no longer enough. Now, he wanted to live. Just when Ronald thought the past had finally loosened its grip, it came knocking, literally. It was a Thursday evening, the air still heavy with Texas heat, when he heard the buzz of the downstairs doorbell. He wasn't expecting anyone. In fact, no one outside of Curtis and his therapist even knew where he lived. He walked cautiously to the peephole and felt his stomach drop. Standing there, dressed far too carefully for a casual visit, was Madison. Lipstick, heels, a fitted blazer, like she was auditioning for forgiveness. She held something in her hand, glanced around nervously, and then, realizing he wasn't going to open the door, bent down and slid it underneath. Ronald didn't move. He waited until her footsteps faded completely before unlocking the door and picking it up. It was a folded sheet of paper, a printed therapy receipt from 2 days prior. Scribbled across the bottom in handwriting he knew too well were the words, "Trying to change. Please talk to me." He stared at it for a long moment, then crumpled it and dropped it straight into the trash. She had found him. And that meant it was time to disappear again. The next morning, Ronald was already online scanning listings. He didn't hesitate. No overthinking. No second-guessing. This wasn't about fear, it was about peace. Within 48 hours, he'd signed a lease on a secured building across town, one with underground parking, coded elevators, and key fob entry to every floor. No street access. No chance of anyone slipping in with a smile and a fake excuse. He packed fast, left no forwarding address, and changed the delivery info for everything from his bank to his burrito place. Only Curtis knew where he went, and even he was told not to share the new address under any circumstances. Ronald updated his phone settings, rerouted his mail to a P.O. box, and even changed his work contact info. It wasn't paranoia, it was boundaries. The past had followed him once. It wouldn't get a second shot. When he finally stood in the middle of his new place, surrounded by unopened boxes and sterile white walls, he didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt something close to relief. He hadn't just escaped a relationship, he had escaped a pattern. And this time, he wasn't waiting around for closure dressed in red lipstick and lies. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where the world feels like it's still waking up. Ronald was sitting alone at a neighborhood cafe tucked between a bookstore and a florist shop, sipping his black coffee and flipping through a paperback he'd already read twice. He wasn't there for anything special, just the stillness, the comfort of people murmuring around him without expecting anything from him. That's when Claire walked in. She wasn't flashy or overly done up, just grounded. Wavy hair pulled back, no makeup, denim jacket, a canvas tote slung over her shoulder. She ordered a tea, sat 2 tables down, and opened her laptop. For 15 minutes, they shared the same space, the kind of quiet proximity that doesn't ask for attention but gently tugs at it anyway. He noticed her smile when she read something on her screen, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the concentration in her brow. And then, without thinking too much, he said something. Just a small comment about the song playing overhead. She laughed, not in a flirtatious way, but a real, unguarded laugh, and replied like they'd known each other longer than a minute. That's how it started. No fireworks. No pressure. Just presence. By the 3rd date, sitting on a bench near Lady Bird Lake with takeout boxes between them, Ronald told her everything. Not the sanitized version, the real one. The betrayal, the ring, the emails, the move, the breakdowns, the therapy. He didn't sugarcoat it or try to make himself sound more noble than he was. He just laid it out, piece by piece, like handing her the broken parts of something he wasn't sure could be rebuilt. Claire didn't flinch. She didn't gasp or recoil or ask for details that would only reopen wounds. She just listened. Quietly. Respectfully. And when he was done, she took a long breath and simply said, "That must have been hell. I'm glad you got out." That was it. No dramatics. No judgment. Just empathy. Ronald felt something shift in that moment. Not the rush of falling for someone new, but the slow, grounding realization that he didn't have to explain himself into being understood. Claire wasn't there to save him. She was just there. They didn't rush anything. There were no grand declarations or curated Instagram stories. Just slow mornings, honest conversations, and small, consistent acts of trust. A text that said "made extra coffee, if you want some." A walk that didn't need words. A shared silence that didn't feel awkward. No illusions. No masks. Just 2 people showing up, scarred but still standing. Ronald didn't know where it would go, and for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare him. Because this wasn't about replacing what was lost. It was about learning how to build something better, with truth, not fantasy. The journal sat open on the windowsill, its pages stained with the soft curl of morning sunlight and ink that bled slightly from writing too hard. Ronald hadn't kept a journal before all this. He always thought it was something other people did, the sentimental kind who processed life in paragraphs. But after everything fell apart, words became survival. Some nights, it was the only place he could tell the truth without interruption. No expectations, no audience. Just him, bleeding quietly onto the page. Today's entry was shorter than usual, but heavier in meaning. This was never about revenge, he wrote, pen dragging slower than normal. It was about remembering who I am. Before the lies, before the betrayal, before I started questioning whether I was enough. I didn't burn her life down, I just turned on the light. And when the light hit everything, the truth was already crumbling. I just finally walked away from the wreckage. He set the pen down and stared at the words for a long moment. There wasn't anger behind them, just clarity. For so long, he thought healing would feel like triumph. But what it really felt like was stillness. The quiet moments with Claire were nothing like what he used to chase. They didn't have to be dramatic or filled with declarations to feel meaningful. And that difference hit him during the most mundane moment, walking beside her in a farmer's market, sunlight on their faces, her hand loosely wrapped around his like she was holding something precious, but not fragile. Madison had always moved fast. Their love was intense, spontaneous, loud. At the time, it had felt exciting, like a movie scene always on the verge of climax. But now he understood that what he thought was passion had really been chaos dressed in pretty words. He remembered how he used to cling to moments with Madison, not because they were peaceful, but because they were addictive. Now, he saw the difference. With Claire, love didn't drain him. It filled him. There were no games, no guessing. Just consistency. Honesty. Trust. She didn't try to patch over his past or pretend it didn't happen. Instead, she gave him space to talk about it, to hold it up to the light without flinching. And when he was silent, she didn't push. She just stayed. Sometimes, that was all he needed. Love, he realized, wasn't supposed to make you feel like you had to fight for breath. It was supposed to feel like coming up for air. It was a quiet evening when he decided to finally let go of the last piece. The old hard drive sat in a drawer, buried under receipts and unused charging cables. He pulled it out slowly, holding it in his palm for a few seconds before plugging it into his laptop. The screen blinked to life, and a folder labeled Madison, Backup opened. Inside were all the images, all the screenshots, all the texts that had once shattered him. For months, he'd held onto them like proof. As if the pain needed to be preserved to validate the damage. But now, looking at them, he didn't feel rage. Just distance. He opened one photo, her smiling in a hotel mirror, dressed in the lingerie Ronald had never seen in person. A lump rose in his throat, but it passed. This wasn't his anymore. This wasn't love. It was a lie caught on camera. He selected everything and right-clicked. Delete. The computer asked him if he was sure. He clicked yes. Then he emptied the trash. Just like that, the evidence was gone. Not because he didn't remember, but because he didn't need to anymore. He wasn't holding on to it for justice. He'd already gotten that. He'd lived it. Letting go now wasn't forgiveness. It was freedom. As the screen returned to the home screen, Ronald leaned back in his chair and let out a slow, measured breath. Not relief. Not finality. Just breath, the kind that didn't catch in his chest anymore. The kind that told him he was still here, and he was still himself. He stood, walked to the kitchen, and poured himself a glass of water. Outside, the city hummed in the distance. Unbothered. Unaware. And that was the beauty of it. Life had moved on. So had he. Not perfectly. Not all at once. But fully. The weight was lighter now. The space inside him wasn't empty, it was open. For what came next? For whoever he became next. Have you ever loved someone so much, you silenced your gut just to keep the fantasy alive? Not because you didn't see the signs, but because you did, and ignoring them felt easier than losing the dream. Maybe you convinced yourself that the silence in their voice was just stress. That the distance was temporary. That love meant pushing through doubt, even when it scraped you raw. Maybe you looked at them and saw the version of them you wanted to see, not the one who was showing up in front of you, day after day, with new lies behind tired smiles. If any of that feels familiar, I see you. I've been you. And if you're reading this right now, maybe it's because you've been carrying something too heavy for too long, wondering if it's you, if you're not enough, if you missed something you should have caught. You didn't. You're not broken. You're just waking up. So tell me, in the comments, did you ever ignore your instincts because you wanted the story to end differently? And if you could go back, would you still choose them? She didn't just cheat. She gave me permission to rebuild. That's the truth I had to choke down over months of sleepless nights, scattered memories, and therapy sessions that tore me wide open. But eventually, I saw it. Her betrayal wasn't the end of me, it was the end of the version of me who tolerated half-truths and called them love. The version who settled for attention when what I needed was partnership. The version who thought loyalty meant staying silent when his heart was screaming. I'm not thankful for what she did. I'll never say that. But I'm grateful for what it forced me to confront. I learned to stop apologizing for expecting honesty. I learned that peace feels nothing like passion, but it lasts longer. And most of all, I learned that being alone doesn't mean being unloved. It means being free to wait for something real. Now, with Claire, I'm not trying to fix anyone. I'm not trying to be impressive. I'm just me, unpolished, imperfect, present. And she meets me there, every time, with nothing but honesty and a steady kind of love that doesn't burn me. It warms me. So if you're standing where I once stood, torn between holding on or finally letting go, maybe this is your sign. Maybe it's not about getting even. Maybe it's about getting out. And once you're out, maybe it's time to ask yourself the question I should have asked way sooner. If they weren't hiding anything, why were you always the one left in the dark?